the Christmas Hamper Conspiracy. Good evening, dear friends. My name is Stephen, and welcome back to Mindful Musings. I invite you to settle in this evening, perhaps with a warm drink and the comfort of your favourite chair, as we return once more to the Highland village of Loch Dubh. Tonight's tale unfolds during the festive season, when the village should be filled with nothing but goodwill and cheer. But, as we shall discover, even the most generous of gestures can conceal the darkest of intentions. Our story follows Police Constable Hamish Macbeth, a man who has made his home in this remote corner of Sutherland, preferring the rhythms of village life to the chaos of city policing. But when luxury Christmas hampers, donated with apparent generosity for the village charity raffle, begin arriving at homes with a deadly secret hidden among their festive treats, Hamish must race against time to stop a killer who has weaponized the very spirit of Christmas itself. Before we begin, I wonder, do you enjoy mysteries that unfold in layers, where every clue reveals another question, and the truth hides in plain sight among the innocent trappings of the season? If so, I would be honoured to have you subscribe to Mindful Musings. Together we shall explore how grudges can fester across years, and how revenge, when served cold, can be the most poisonous dish of all. Now, let us begin our tale of charity, conspiracy, and the settling of old accounts, the Christmas Hamper Conspiracy, a Hamish Macbeth mystery. Chapter 1. The First Gift of Christmas. The first week of December had transformed Loch Dubh into a scene worthy of any Christmas card. Strings of lights crisscrossed the main street, shop windows displayed festive decorations, and the village hall had been converted into headquarters for the annual Christmas charity drive. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth stood outside the hall, watching volunteers carry boxes of donations inside, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. His dog, Lugs, sat at his feet with his mismatched ears alert, while his cat, Sonzi, had sensibly remained by the fire at the police station. The charity drive was Mrs. Wellington's pride and joy. The minister's wife had organised it for 15 years, raising money to provide Christmas hampers for families struggling to make ends meet. This year, however, something extraordinary had happened. An anonymous donor had provided 50 luxury hampers, each worth over £200, filled with expensive foods, wines and treats that would make any Christmas dinner spectacular. The hampers had arrived at the village hall 3 days earlier, each one beautifully wrapped with a card reading simply, "For the people of Loch Dubh, with gratitude." Mrs. Wellington had been beside herself with excitement. "Hamish," she had declared, waving the accompanying letter, "this is the most generous donation we have ever received. 50 hampers. Whoever sent them must have spent thousands of pounds." The letter, typed and unsigned, had explained that the donor wished to remain anonymous but had deep ties to Loch Dubh and wanted to give back to the community. The hampers would be distributed through the usual raffle system, with tickets sold to raise additional funds for the charity. Hamish had examined the hampers when they arrived, his policeman's instincts making him cautious of such extravagant anonymous generosity. But everything had seemed legitimate. The hampers were professionally packed, containing jars of preserves, tins of biscuits, bottles of wine and whiskey, Christmas puddings, specialty cheeses, crackers, and various other delicacies. Each item bore the label of well-known Scottish producers. There was nothing obviously suspicious about any of it. The raffle had been held 2 nights ago, with tickets selling out within hours. The winners had been announced at the village hall, their names drawn from a barrel by Reverend Macpherson. Hamish remembered the excitement, the cheers as each name was called, the delight on the faces of those lucky enough to win such magnificent prizes. He had even bought tickets himself, though he had not won. The hampers had been distributed immediately, winners carrying their prizes home with expressions of wonder and gratitude. Now, standing in the cold December morning, Hamish was thinking about how well the charity drive had gone when his mobile phone rang. It was Dr. Brodie, and the elderly physician's voice carried an urgency that made Hamish's stomach clench. "Hamish, you need to come to the Mackenzie house immediately. Donald Mackenzie is dead, and I believe he has been poisoned." The drive to the Mackenzie croft took 10 minutes through narrow roads lined with snow. Donald Mackenzie was a sheep farmer in his 60s, a quiet man who kept to himself but was well liked in the village. Hamish arrived to find Dr. Brodie's car already there, along with an ambulance. The doctor met him at the door, his weathered face grave. "Donald died about an hour ago," Brodie said quietly. His wife Ellen found him collapsed in the kitchen. The symptoms were consistent with poisoning, severe abdominal pain, vomiting, convulsions. "I have called for the pathologist, but Hamish, I think this was deliberate." Ellen Mackenzie sat in the living room, being comforted by the paramedics. She was a small woman in her 50s, her face pale with shock. Hamish approached her gently. "Mrs. Mackenzie, I am so sorry for your loss. Can you tell me what happened this morning?" Ellen looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "We were having breakfast," she said, her voice shaking. "Donald was so pleased with the hamper we won. He opened the jar of honey, said he was going to have it on his toast. Such lovely honey it looked, dark and thick. He ate 2 slices, said it was the best he had ever tasted. Then, about 20 minutes later, he started feeling poorly. The pain came on so sudden, so terrible. He collapsed before I could even call for help." Hamish felt cold certainty settling over him. "Can I see the honey jar?" Ellen pointed to the kitchen. "It is still on the table." "We did not touch anything after," the doctor said to leave it. The kitchen was a typical farmhouse room, warm and cluttered with the comfortable accumulation of years. On the table sat the remains of breakfast, 2 plates, a teapot, and a jar of honey with its lid removed. The jar was elegant, with a handwritten label reading Highland Heather Honey. Hamish bent close without touching it, examining the contents. The honey was dark, almost amber, and had a slightly unusual sheen to it. He could see the 2 slices of toast on Donald's plate, the honey spread thick and golden on the surface. "Where is the hamper the honey came from?" Hamish asked Ellen. "In the pantry," she replied. "We were so excited to have won it. All those lovely things. We had not opened anything else yet, just the honey." Hamish found the hamper in the pantry, still mostly packed. He examined each item carefully, noting the labels, the packaging, the presentation. Everything looked professional and legitimate. But that honey jar, he thought, that honey jar had killed Donald Mackenzie. He called Detective Chief Inspector Blair in Strathbane, explaining the situation. Blair's response was typical. "Poisoned honey in a charity hamper. Are you sure, Macbeth?" Maybe the old man just had a heart attack. "Sir, Dr. Brodie is certain it was poisoning, and the timing is too coincidental. The man ate honey from the hamper and was dead within an hour. We need to treat this as murder." Blair grumbled, but agreed to send a forensics team. In the meantime, he instructed Hamish to secure the scene and prevent anyone else from consuming anything from the Mackenzie hamper. After ending the call, Hamish stood in the farmhouse kitchen, looking at the innocent-looking jar of honey that had become a murder weapon. 50 hampers had been distributed across the village. If the honey in this one was poisoned, were others also contaminated? And if so, how many people were in danger right now? He immediately called Mrs. Wellington. "I need you to contact everyone who won a hamper," he said urgently. "Tell them not to eat or drink anything from it until further notice. Tell them it is a police matter and they must comply immediately." "But Hamish, why? What is wrong?" Mrs. Wellington's confusion was evident. "Just do it, please, and do it now. Donald Mackenzie is dead, possibly poisoned by something in his hamper. We need to stop anyone else from being harmed." Mrs. Wellington gasped. Then her voice became brisk and efficient. "I will call everyone immediately. I have the list of all 50 winners right here." Hamish returned to his Land Rover and began driving through the village, stopping at houses where he knew hamper winners lived. At each stop, he delivered the same message. Do not consume anything from the hamper. It is a police matter. The reactions varied from confusion to alarm to outright disbelief. But everyone complied. By midday, Hamish had personally visited 20 houses, and Mrs. Wellington had contacted the rest by telephone. As he drove back toward the police station, his mobile rang again. It was Blair. "Macbeth, we have another one. Jessie Campbell found dead in her cottage an hour ago. Same symptoms as Mackenzie. What did she eat from her hamper?" Hamish felt his blood run cold. "I do not know yet, sir. I'm on my way there now." 2 dead already, and they had only just begun to investigate. How many more poisoned items were sitting in village homes, waiting to be opened, waiting to kill? The scope of this case was staggering, and somewhere in Lochdoub someone had planned this elaborate, terrible revenge. Chapter 2. The Pattern Emerges. Jessie Campbell's cottage sat on the edge of the village, a small, neat house with a garden that, in summer, was the envy of her neighbours. In winter, it looked forlorn under its blanket of snow. Hamish arrived to find Dr. Brodie already there, along with the paramedics and the local constable from Nothen, who had been first on the scene. Dr. Brodie met Hamish at the door, his expression grim. "Same symptoms as Donald Mackenzie," he said without preamble. "Severe poisoning." Jessie was found by her neighbour, who had come to borrow some milk. She had been dead for perhaps 2 hours when I arrived. "What did she consume from the hamper?" Hamish asked. Brodie led him inside. "From what I can determine, she made herself a cup of tea with one of the specialty tea blends from the hamper. The tin is still on the counter, and her teacup is on the table. She never finished it. The cottage interior was cosy, filled with photographs and knickknacks collected over a lifetime. Jessie had been a widow in her 70s, living alone but active in village life. On the kitchen counter sat an elegant tin labelled Highland Breakfast Blend with ornate lettering and a small illustration of heather. The tin was open, and Hamish could see the loose tea leaves inside, dark and fragrant. A teacup sat on the small kitchen table, still half full of amber liquid. Hamish pulled on latex gloves and carefully examined the tin without moving it. The tea looked normal, smelled normal, but so had the honey that had killed Donald Mackenzie. 2 victims, 2 different products from the hampers. That suggested either multiple items were poisoned, or the poisoner had deliberately varied their method to create confusion. The forensics team arrived from Strathbane an hour later, led by a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Ferguson, whom Hamish had worked with before. She took one look at the scene and immediately began cataloguing evidence. "We will need to test everything in both hampers," she said. "The honey from Mackenzie's and the tea from here, obviously, but also every other item. If we are dealing with a deliberate poisoning campaign, we need to identify all contaminated products. How long will that take?" Hamish asked. "For preliminary results on the honey and tea, perhaps 24 hours if I push the lab. For everything else, longer. Days, possibly. We are talking about testing dozens of items for a range of possible toxins." "We do not have days," Hamish said quietly. "There are 48 more hampers out there in people's homes." Dr. Ferguson nodded. "Then you better hope we get lucky and identify the poison quickly. If we know what we are looking for, we can test faster." Detective Chief Inspector Blair arrived that afternoon, his bulk filling the small cottage as he surveyed the scene. 2 deaths, Macbeth," he said, his face red from cold and agitation. 2 deaths from your bloody charity hampers. The press is going to have a field day with this. Poisoned Christmas presents, killer charity drive. We need to find who did this before there are more bodies." Hamish had been thinking about the logistics. "Sir, whoever did this had to have access to the hampers before they were distributed. That means they either tampered with them at the source, or they got access to them while they were at the village hall." Blair nodded. "Check the hall, see if there was any time the hampers were left unsecured. And we need to know where they came from originally. The donation letter said they were from a grateful benefactor, but hampers like these do not just appear out of thin air. Someone ordered them, packed them, shipped them. We trace that chain. We find our killer." Hamish returned to the village hall, where Mrs. Wellington was coordinating with volunteers to collect all the distributed hampers. The winners had been instructed to return them for safety testing, and most had complied, though a few had grumbled about police interference ruining Christmas. Mrs. Wellington looked exhausted and deeply distressed. "Hamish," she said when she saw him, "I cannot believe this is happening. Those hampers were meant to bring joy, and instead they have brought death." "Tell me about when the hampers arrived," Hamish said gently. "Who delivered them? How were they stored?" Mrs. Wellington consulted her notes. "They were delivered by a courier service, Macnab Deliveries from Inverness, 3 days ago on the 2nd of December. The driver said they had been prepaid, with instructions to deliver them here. I signed for them, and we stored them in the hall's storage room until the raffle. The storage room was kept locked the entire time?" Yes, Mrs. Wellington confirmed. I had the only key. The hampers were perfectly safe. Were they? Hamish asked quietly. Was anyone else in the storage room between delivery and distribution? Mrs. Wellington frowned, thinking. Well, yes. Several volunteers went in to help organise the raffle set-up the day before the draw. We needed to count the hampers, make sure we had everything ready, but they were supervised the entire time. Who were the volunteers? Mrs. Wellington provided a list of 6 names. Hamish recognised all of them, locals who had been helping with the charity drive for years, but one of them, or someone else with access, could have tampered with specific hampers during those preparations. He needed to interview each volunteer, and he needed to trace the hampers back to their source. The courier company, Macbeth Deliveries, was his next stop. He drove to Inverness that evening, arriving at the depot as it was closing. The manager, a harried man named Stuart Macnab, pulled up the delivery records on his computer. I remember that job, Macnab said. 50 luxury hampers, massive delivery. The order came in 2 weeks ago, prepaid with a bank transfer. We picked them up from a warehouse in Inverness and delivered them to Loch Dubh. Do you still have the pickup address? Hamish asked. Macnab scrolled through his records. Here it is. Unit 12, Cromwell Industrial Estate. That is a storage facility, not a shop. The hampers were already packed when we collected them, sitting on pallets, ready to go. We just loaded them and made the delivery. Who placed the order? Macnab pulled up more information. The account was registered to Highland Luxury Goods, but there is no phone number on file, just an email address. Payment came through a business bank account. Everything seemed legitimate at the time. Can you give me that email address and the bank details? Hamish copied down the information, knowing it would take time to trace. Anonymous donations paid through business accounts were difficult to investigate quickly. He drove to the Cromwell Industrial Estate, but the storage units were all locked for the night, and the management office was closed. He would have to return in the morning. Back in Loch Dubh, Hamish spent the evening interviewing the volunteers who had helped organise the raffle. Each one told the same story. They had been in the storage room for perhaps an hour, counting hampers, arranging them for easy distribution after the draw. The hampers had been sealed, wrapped, professional-looking. No one had opened any of them. No one had tampered with anything. But Hamish noticed something in their statements. For about 20 minutes during the setup, the volunteers had all gone to the main hall to discuss raffle ticket pricing with Mrs. Wellington. The storage room had been left unlocked during that time, though it was only briefly. 20 minutes, Hamish thought. That would be enough time for someone to slip in, open specific hampers, contaminate selected items, reseal everything, and leave without being noticed. The killer had been careful, had planned this meticulously. He returned to the police station late that night to find Dr. Ferguson had called with preliminary results. Hamish, she said when he rang her back, we have identified the poison in both cases, aconitine, derived from monkshood. It is a highly toxic alkaloid, extremely deadly in small doses. Both the honey and the tea were heavily contaminated with it. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Aconitine. Poisoning is agonizing, and once symptoms begin, almost always fatal. How much would be needed? Hamish asked. Not much. A teaspoon of contaminated honey or a cup of poisoned tea would be more than sufficient. The killer only needed to add a small amount to each targeted item. Then they could have poisoned dozens of products, Hamish said, feeling cold dread. Every hamper could contain something deadly. We need to test everything, every single item from all 50 hampers. Ferguson agreed. We are already starting, but it will take time. In the meantime, make sure no one consumes anything from those hampers. Not even a biscuit, not even a sip of wine. Everything is potentially contaminated. Hamish sat in his station after the call, lugs at his feet, thinking through what they knew. 2 people dead from poisoned items in luxury hampers. The hampers had been stored in a warehouse, packed by someone operating under a false business name, and delivered as an anonymous donation. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to create these deadly gifts, and someone had specifically chosen who would receive which hamper. The raffle was random, he thought, but what if it was not? What if the killer had somehow controlled which hampers went to which people? He pulled out the list of raffle winners and studied the names. Donald Mackenzie and Jessie Campbell were the victims. What connected them? He needed to find out, because somewhere in that connection lay the motive for these terrible murders. Chapter 3. Ghosts of Commerce Past. The morning brought fresh snow and grim news. Dr. Ferguson called to report that preliminary testing had found aconitine contamination in 7 more items from various hampers, including jars of jam, bottles of cordial, and even a Christmas pudding. The poison had been carefully introduced into products with dark colours and strong flavours that would mask any unusual taste. 7 contaminated items out of 50 hampers meant more deaths were possible if people had already consumed anything before the warning was issued. Hamish spent the early hours calling every hamper winner personally, emphasising the critical importance of not consuming anything. Detective Chief Inspector Blair arrived in Lochdoub mid-morning, bringing with him additional constables and a liaison from the Food Standards Agency. "We are treating this as a major incident," Blair announced in the church hall, which had been converted into an incident room. "Multiple poisonings, potential terrorism, whatever you want to call it." Macbeth. What do we know about the victims? Hamish had spent the previous evening researching Donald Mackenzie and Jessie Campbell, looking for any connection between them. Both were long-time residents of Lochdoub, he explained. Mackenzie was a sheep farmer, kept to himself mostly. Jessie Campbell worked for years at the village post office before retiring. On the surface, they had little in common. Different ages, different social circles. But I think the connection is going to be in their past, not their present. "What makes you say that?" Blair demanded. "Because of something I noticed when I was researching the items in the hampers," Hamish said. He pulled out photographs of various product labels from the contaminated items. "Look at these labels carefully. They all carry the names of legitimate Scottish food producers, but several of them have an unusual additional line of text at the bottom, very small." He pointed to the honey jar that had killed Donald Mackenzie. "See here, under the main label, produced using traditional methods from Glenross Specialty Foods." He showed them the tea tin from Jessie Campbell's cottage. "Same thing, premium selection from Glenross Specialty Foods." "Glenross Specialty Foods," Blair said slowly. "Do we know that company?" Hamish nodded grimly. "I looked them up in old business records last night. Glenross Specialty Foods was a shop and mail order business that operated in Lochdoub 15 years ago. It specialised in luxury Scottish foods, the exact kind of items found in these hampers. The business went bankrupt in 2010 and closed down. The owner lost everything. The room went quiet as the implications sank in. "Someone connected to that failed business is behind this," Blair said. "Someone who blames certain people for its closure and has spent 15 years planning revenge. Do we know who owned Glenross Specialty Foods?" Hamish pulled out a printout from the company's house database. Robert and Margaret Crawford. They were in their 40s when the business failed. They would be in their 60s now. I remember them vaguely from when I first came to Lochdoub. They ran the shop on the high street before it closed. What happened to them after the bankruptcy? "They left the village," Hamish said. "Moved away, I do not know where, but someone remembers them, and someone is using their business name as a signature on these murders." "We need to find the Crawfords," Blair said. "Track them down, interview them, find out if they are involved or if someone else is using their name. And we need to understand what caused the business to fail. If people are being murdered over a 15-year-old bankruptcy, there must be more to the story." Hamish spent the afternoon talking to long-time residents about Glenross Specialty Foods. The picture that emerged was complicated. Robert and Margaret Crawford had moved to Lochdoub in 2005, buying the old bakery building on the high street and converting it into a specialty food shop. They had been enthusiastic, invested their life savings, and worked tirelessly to build a successful business. For a few years it had thrived, selling high-end Scottish foods to tourists and running a mail-order catalogue for customers across the country. Then things began to go wrong. Hamish talked to Mrs. Wellington, who remembered the Crawfords well. They were nice people, hard-working, she said, but they faced problems from the start. Locals resented outsiders coming in and setting up what they saw as a fancy shop for tourists. There were complaints about their prices, about them taking business from local producers. Angela Brodie, the doctor's wife, provided more detail. Margaret Crawford was so excited about the business, she recalled. She would source products from local suppliers, work with farmers and artisan food makers. But there were disputes about money, about contracts. Several suppliers claimed the Crawfords owed them money, and the Crawfords claimed the suppliers had provided substandard products. It got quite bitter. The final blow, Hamish learned from Mr. Patel at the village shop, had been a food safety issue. There was a problem with some of their products, Patel explained. Something about contaminated preserves, I think. Several customers got sick, there was an investigation, and the business was shut down temporarily. By the time they were allowed to reopen, their reputation was destroyed, and they had run out of money. They filed for bankruptcy and left the village soon after. Do you remember who the suppliers were that had disputes with the Crawfords? Hamish asked. Patel thought for a moment. Donald Mackenzie was one of them. He provided lamb for their frozen meat pies. There was a big argument about payment, I remember. The Crawfords claimed the lamb was not fresh, and Donald claimed they were trying to cheat him out of what he was owed. Hamish felt the pieces beginning to connect. Donald Mackenzie, poisoned by honey. What about Jessie Campbell? Was she connected to the Crawfords' business? She was not a supplier, but she was involved in the food safety investigation, Patel said. Jessie worked at the post office, and she was the one who reported that several mail-order customers had complained about being sick after eating Glen Ross products. Her report triggered the health department investigation. So both victims had played roles in the downfall of Glen Ross Specialty Foods, Hamish said slowly. Mackenzie threw the supplier dispute. Campbell threw the food safety report. Someone is settling accounts for what happened 15 years ago. Hamish reported his findings to Blair, who immediately ordered a search for Robert and Margaret Crawford. The results came back that evening. Robert Crawford died of a heart attack 3 years ago, a constable reported. But Margaret Crawford is alive. She is living in a nursing home in Inverness, has been there for 2 years. Severe dementia. The staff say she does not recognise anyone and can barely communicate. So, it is not the Crawfords themselves, Blair said. But it could be someone connected to them. Do they have children? The constable checked his notes. One son, David Crawford. He was 20 when the business failed, would be 35 now. No criminal record, but there is not much information on him. He seems to have stayed out of trouble and kept a low profile. Find him, Blair ordered. I want to know where he is and what he has been doing for the past 15 years. Hamish drove to the nursing home in Inverness that evening, arriving just before visiting hours ended. Margaret Crawford was in a room overlooking a snow-covered garden. She sat in a chair by the window, staring out at nothing, her once vibrant face now slack and vacant. Mrs. Crawford, Hamish said gently, sitting beside her. My name is Hamish Macbeth. I am a police officer. I need to ask you about your son, David. Where is he? Margaret did not respond, did not even seem to notice him. A nurse approached, shaking her head sympathetically. She does not communicate much, I am afraid. The dementia has progressed quite far. Does she have regular visitors? The nurse consulted a log. Her son visits once a month. He was here last month, actually, stayed for about an hour. Does he leave contact information? The nurse showed Hamish the visitor log. David Crawford had signed in with an address in Edinburgh and a mobile phone number. Hamish copied down both. As he left the nursing home, he called the number, but it went straight to voicemail. Mr. Crawford, this is Police Constable Hamish Macbeth from Lochdoub. I need to speak with you urgently about a police matter. Please call me back immediately. He drove to the Edinburgh address, a flat in a converted warehouse near the water. The building manager told him David Crawford had moved out 6 months earlier, leaving no forwarding address. David Crawford had gone to ground, and Hamish suspected he knew why. The son of Robert and Margaret Crawford, who had watched his parents lose everything 15 years ago, had decided it was time for revenge. Chapter 4. The List of Retribution. The incident room in Lochdoub's church hall had been transformed into the nerve centre of a major investigation. Maps covered the walls, showing the locations of all 50 Hamper recipients. Photographs of victims, suspects, and evidence formed a growing web of connections. Detective Chief Inspector Blair stood at the centre of it all, barking orders at constables and forensic technicians. Hamish arrived early, having spent a restless night thinking about David Crawford and what drove someone to plan such elaborate revenge. We have identified 5 more people who had connections to the Crawfords' failed business, Blair announced when the morning briefing began. A constable distributed copies of a list. These are people who either had supplier disputes with Glenross Specialty Foods, or who were involved in the bankruptcy proceedings, or who made public complaints about the business. All 5 of them were raffle winners and received hampers. All 5 are potential targets. Hamish scanned the list. Besides Donald Mackenzie and Jesse Campbell, who were already dead, there were 5 names. Thomas Henderson, a dairy farmer who had sued the Crawfords over unpaid bills. Mary Sutherland, who had worked as a shop assistant at Glenross and had testified against the Crawfords during the food safety investigation. Gordon Leslie, a solicitor who had handled the bankruptcy proceedings. Sarah Mitchell, a journalist who had written damning articles about the business failure for the local paper. And William Ross, a health inspector who had signed the closure order for Glenross Specialty Foods. 7 people total who had played roles, large or small, in the destruction of the Crawford family business. We need to bring all 5 survivors into protective custody, Blair said. If Crawford is working through a revenge list, they are all in danger. We also need to determine which specific items in their hampers are contaminated so we can establish the pattern. But there is a problem, a forensic technician interjected. Dr. Ferguson has tested all the items from the 7 hampers belonging to people on this list. Only 3 hampers contained contaminated items, Mackenzie's, Campbell's and Henderson's. The others are clean. Hamish felt a chill. That means the poisoning was targeted. Crawford did not contaminate random hampers hoping the right people would win them. He somehow ensured specific hampers went to specific people. But the raffle was random, Blair protested. Names were drawn from a barrel. How could anyone control who won what? Hamish thought back to the raffle night. Mrs. Wellington had organised it, as she did every year. Tickets were sold, each with a unique number. Winners' ticket numbers were drawn, then matched to the purchaser's name. The hampers had been numbered 1 through 50, and they were distributed in numerical order as names were called. What if Crawford knew who had purchased which ticket numbers? Hamish said slowly. What if he had access to that information and contaminated specific hampers that he knew would go to specific people? Blair's eyes narrowed. Check the raffle records. Find out if there was any way Crawford could have known ticket assignments before the draw. Hamish returned to Mrs. Wellington's house, where she kept meticulous records of all charity drive activities. She showed him the ticket sales ledger, where each sold ticket was recorded with the buyer's name. The tickets were numbered sequentially, Mrs. Wellington explained. As people bought them, I wrote down their names next to their ticket numbers in this ledger. Then on raffle night, we drew numbers from the barrel, and I consulted the ledger to announce the winners. Where did you keep this ledger before the raffle? In my study at home, Mrs. Wellington said. Why? Could anyone have had access to it? Mrs. Wellington thought carefully. Well, volunteers came by several times to help with preparations. They might have been in my study briefly. But no one had reason to look at the ledger. Hamish examined the study. The ledger had been kept on Mrs. Wellington's desk, clearly visible to anyone entering the room. A photograph would be enough, he realised. Crawford or an accomplice could have visited, taken a quick photo of the ledger with a mobile phone, and had all the information needed to target specific hampers to specific people. But that still leaves the question of how he accessed the hampers to contaminate them, Blair said, when Hamish reported his theory. They were delivered sealed and stored locked at the village hall. Hamish thought back to his interviews with the volunteers. There had been a window of opportunity, those 20 minutes when the storage room was left unlocked while everyone discussed ticket pricing. What if Crawford had been waiting for exactly that opportunity? What if he was in the village, watching, ready to act the moment he had access? We need to check if anyone saw a stranger around the village hall on the day before the raffle, Hamish said. Someone who might have slipped into the storage room during that 20-minute window. The canvassing of witnesses took most of the day. Hamish and the other constables interviewed everyone who had been near the village hall during the set-up period. Most people remembered the usual volunteers, familiar faces from the community. But one witness, a teenager named Danny Morrison, remembered seeing someone unusual. There was a man I did not recognize, Danny said when Hamish interviewed him. He was standing outside the hall smoking a cigarette. I noticed because we do not get many strangers in December, you know. Tourists are gone by then. Can you describe him? Dark-haired, maybe mid-30s, wearing a waxed jacket and jeans. He seemed to be waiting for something. When I walked past him to go into the hall, he nodded at me, friendly-like. Then when I came out about 5 minutes later, he was gone. What time was this? Around 3 o'clock, maybe 3:30. That was exactly when the volunteers had left the storage room unlocked to consult with Mrs. Wellington. Hamish showed Danny a photograph from Margaret Crawford's nursing home room, a picture of her son David taken a few years earlier. Danny studied it and nodded. That could be him, yeah. The hair is the same, and the build. It was getting dark, and I did not look closely, but that could definitely be him. Hamish now had confirmation that David Crawford had been in Lochduv, had likely accessed the Hampers, and had contaminated specific ones intended for his revenge targets. But they still needed to find him before he could strike again, assuming he had more attacks planned. Dr. Ferguson called with an update on the contaminated items. We have now tested everything from all 50 hampers, she reported. In total, we found 12 contaminated items across 7 hampers. The 7 hampers belonging to people on your list. The other 43 hampers were completely clean. So Crawford was precise, Hamish said. He only poisoned the hampers going to people he blamed for his family's ruin. That makes him calculated and methodical, but it also gives us a clear victim profile. The 5 surviving people on the list need immediate protection. Thomas Henderson, the dairy farmer, was brought in first. He was a broad man in his 60s with a red face and a belligerent attitude. I do not need police protection, he declared when Hamish explained the situation. I can take care of myself. Mr. Henderson, Hamish said patiently, 2 people are dead from poisoned food items in hampers, identical to the one you received. Your hamper contained a contaminated jar of raspberry jam. If you had eaten it, you would be dead too. Henderson's bluster faded slightly. The Crawford boy is doing this? After all these years? I did not even remember there had been a dispute until you brought it up. His father owed me £3,000 for dairy products. I had every right to sue. No one is saying you did not, Hamish assured him. But David Crawford clearly sees it differently. Until we apprehend him, you need to stay somewhere safe. The other 4 potential victims were gathered over the course of the afternoon. Mary Sutherland, the former shop assistant, was frightened and cooperative. Gordon Leslie, the solicitor, was sceptical but agreed to protection. Sarah Mitchell, the journalist, wanted to write about the case and had to be firmly told this was not an opportunity for a story. William Ross, the health inspector, was retired and living quietly, shocked to learn he was on someone's revenge list. We will place you all in a secure location until Crawford is apprehended, Blair told them. In the meantime, we are intensifying the search for him. All ports and airports have been alerted, his photograph has been distributed to all police forces, and we have frozen his bank accounts. He cannot hide forever. But Hamish was not so sure. David Crawford had planned this meticulously for years, probably since his father's death 3 years ago when the restraining presence of Robert Crawford was removed. Someone that patient, that careful, would have contingency plans. That evening, as the potential victims were being moved to a safe house in Strathbane, Hamish returned to his police station to find a letter had been pushed through the mail slot. It was addressed to him in neat handwriting, and it contained a single typed page. Police Constable Macbeth, it read. By now you have worked out who I am and what I am doing. You are clever, I will give you that. Not like the fools in Strathbane who stumble about breaking things. I want you to understand why. My parents were good people who worked hard and dreamed of building something lasting. They poured everything into Glenross Specialty Foods, not just money but their hearts and souls. And Lochduv destroyed them. The suppliers who cheated them, the officials who persecuted them, the people who spread lies and ruined their reputation. My father died of a broken heart, and my mother's mind shattered under the grief. They took everything from my family, so I am taking everything from them. An eye for an eye, as they say. You cannot stop me. I have been planning this for too long, and I'm far more careful than you imagine. Merry Christmas, Constable. I hope you enjoy the festivities. It was signed simply, D. Crawford. Chapter 5. The Hunt Intensifies. The letter from David Crawford was immediately sent to forensics for analysis, though Hamish suspected it would yield nothing useful. Someone who had planned poisonings this meticulously would not be careless enough to leave fingerprints or DNA on a letter. Still, they had to try every avenue. Detective Chief Inspector Blair read the letter with a mixture of fury and frustration. "He is taunting us," Blair said, his face even redder than usual. "Thinks he is some kind of mastermind." "Well, we will show him. Macbeth, I want every resource we have focused on finding this man." The forensic analysis came back within hours, confirming Hamish's suspicions. The letter had been typed on a common printer, the paper was available at any stationery shop, and there were no usable fingerprints or DNA. The envelope had been sealed with a damp sponge rather than saliva, preventing DNA collection from that source. David Crawford had been careful, as he had been with everything else. But the letter did provide one useful piece of information. Crawford was still watching Loch Dubh, still aware of what the police were doing. That meant he was either still in the area or had someone feeding him information. Hamish considered the implications. If Crawford was nearby, he might try to strike again despite the police presence. The 5 surviving targets were now in protective custody, but Crawford might have a backup plan, or additional targets the police had not identified. "We need to look deeper into the Crawford family history," Hamish said during the evening briefing. "There might be other people Crawford blames, people who are not on our current list." Blair nodded. "Do it, and check surveillance footage from around the village. If Crawford is watching us, he has to be somewhere." The problem was that Loch Dubh, being a small highland village, had very little surveillance coverage. There were a few cameras at the hotel and one at the bank, but most of the village remained unmonitored. Hamish requested footage from what cameras existed, while also organising foot patrols to watch for anyone suspicious. Angela Brodie provided valuable assistance in researching the Crawford family history. She had known Margaret Crawford personally, and still had some old correspondence from when Glenross Specialty Foods was operating. Margaret was so proud of that business, Angela said, showing Hamish boxes of old letters and newsletters. She would send these beautiful catalogues featuring Scottish food producers. She truly believed she was supporting local businesses and preserving culinary traditions. "What went wrong?" Hamish asked, though he was beginning to understand. "Pride and naivety," Angela said sadly. The Crawfords were outsiders, English originally, though Robert had Scottish ancestry. They did not understand Highland business culture, the importance of relationships and history. They treated suppliers with contracts and deadlines rather than the personal approach people expected, and when things went wrong, as they inevitably do in any business, there was no foundation of trust to fall back on. Hamish found a newsletter from December 2009, just months before Glenross Specialty Foods collapsed. It featured an article written by Margaret Crawford about quality control and sourcing standards. Reading between the lines, it was clear the Crawfords had been having disputes with suppliers who they felt were providing substandard products. The tone was superior, condescending, implying that local producers did not meet their high standards. No wonder people turned against them, Hamish thought. The Crawfords had essentially accused their suppliers of incompetence in a public newsletter. Wounded pride in a small community could fester into lasting resentment, but it flowed both ways. The suppliers felt insulted, the Crawfords felt cheated, and nobody was willing to back down. The final collapse came in March 2010. Hamish found newspaper articles from the Highland Gazette that Sarah Mitchell had written. "Health Scare Closes Local Food Shop," read one headline. "Investigation Reveals Safety Violations at Glenross Specialty Foods," read another. The articles were factual but damning, painting the Crawfords as negligent business owners who had put customers at risk. Hamish tracked down Sarah Mitchell, who was currently in protective custody at the safe house in Strathbane. He drove there to interview her, finding her in a secure room with a police guard outside. "I've been thinking about those articles," Sarah said, when Hamish asked about her coverage of the Glenross closure. "I was young, eager to make a name for myself as an investigative journalist. The food safety story was big news for our small paper, and I pursued it aggressively." "Too aggressively, perhaps." "What do you mean?" Hamish asked. "I reported the facts accurately," Sarah said slowly, "but I also reported unverified rumours and speculation. There were whispers that the Crawfords had knowingly sold contaminated products, that they had ignored warnings, that they were more interested in profit than safety. I included those whispers in my articles, attributed to anonymous sources. Looking back, I realise I helped destroy their reputation without having solid proof of the most serious allegations. "So you feel guilty?" Hamish observed. "Enormously," Sarah admitted. "A few years after they left, I tried to find them to apologise. But by then Robert was dead, and Margaret was already losing her mental faculties. I never got the chance to tell them I was sorry, and now their son is trying to kill me for what I wrote." Hamish returned to Lochdoub as evening fell, troubled by the complexity of the case. The Crawfords had not been innocent victims. They had made real mistakes and had antagonised people. But their punishment had far exceeded their crimes, and they had paid with everything they had. David Crawford had watched his parents destroyed and had decided that only blood could balance those scales. The question was whether he considered his revenge complete or whether he had more planned. The 5 surviving targets were safe, but was there anyone else Crawford might blame? Hamish spent that evening reviewing every document related to Glen Ross Specialty Foods' collapse. He found the bankruptcy court records, the health department investigation reports, the supplier complaints, and the final closure documents. Each paper represented another person who had played a role in the Crawford family tragedy. Most of those people were already on the target list, but one name kept appearing that was not. Fiona MacLeod, the Chief Environmental Health Officer who had overseen the food safety investigation. She had signed many of the documents, had made the final determination that Glen Ross Specialty Foods posed a public health risk. Hamish checked the raffle winner list. Fiona MacLeod had not won a hamper, but that did not mean she was safe. If Crawford had been unable to deliver a poisoned hamper to her through the raffle, he might have an alternative plan. Hamish immediately called Fiona MacLeod's home number. Her husband answered, his voice worried. "Fiona is not here," he said. "She went to Edinburgh 3 days ago for a conference. She's supposed to be back tomorrow. Has she called you?" "She called this evening. Said she was fine and looking forward to coming home." "Why?" "Do you have her mobile number?" Hamish asked urgently. The husband provided it, and Hamish called immediately, but it went to voicemail. He left an urgent message asking Fiona to call him back, then contacted Edinburgh police to request they check on her at her hotel. An hour later, Edinburgh police called back with disturbing news. Fiona MacLeod is not at her hotel. She checked in 3 days ago, but has not been seen since yesterday morning. Her room was searched, and we found her mobile phone and wallet in the room, which is unusual. It looks like she left for her conference and never came back. Hamish felt cold certainty settling over him. David Crawford had not been in Lochdoub today. He had been in Edinburgh, and he had taken Fiona MacLeod. Blair mobilised every available resource. All police forces in Scotland were alerted. David Crawford's photograph was distributed to media outlets with a public appeal for information. Fiona MacLeod's description was circulated as a missing person, but Hamish knew they were running out of time. If Crawford had taken Fiona, he would not keep her alive long. The man had shown through his careful poisonings that he was methodical but ruthless. A direct kidnapping suggested he had something special planned for the environmental health officer who had signed the death warrant for his family's business. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A woman called the police hotline late that evening to report seeing a man matching David Crawford's description at a remote cottage in the Cairngorms. The caller was a cleaner who serviced holiday rentals, and she had seen a man arriving at one of the properties with what looked like a woman who seemed unsteady on her feet. The cottage belonged to a client who was supposedly abroad, and the cleaner thought it was suspicious. Armed police surrounded the cottage in the early hours of the morning. Hamish and Blair were there, watching from a command vehicle as the tactical team moved into position. Through thermal imaging, they could see 2 heat signatures inside the building, one moving around normally, the other stationary in what appeared to be a back bedroom. On Blair's command, the tactical team breached the door. Hamish heard shouting, the sound of struggle, then silence. A few minutes later, the team leader emerged. "We have them both. Crawford is in custody, and we found Fiona MacLeod. She is alive but drugged. She needs medical attention immediately." Hamish entered the cottage as paramedics rushed to treat Fiona. David Crawford sat on the floor in handcuffs, a lean man in his 30s with dark hair and the exhausted look of someone who had been running for a long time. In the back bedroom, Hamish found what Crawford had been preparing, a table set with fine china, crystal glasses, and a meal that looked professionally prepared. In the centre of the table was a covered silver serving dish. Hamish lifted the cover and found what he expected, food laced with aconitine. Crawford had planned to force Fiona MacLeod to eat a poisoned final meal, making her death symbolic and agonizing. "You got here sooner than I expected," Crawford said, when Blair and Hamish stood over him. "I thought I had more time." Hamish looked at the defeated man before him. "Was it worth it, Mr. Crawford? Taking all these lives, destroying yourself in the process?" "My parents are dead because of these people," Crawford said flatly. "My father worked himself to death trying to recover from the bankruptcy. My mother lost her mind from the grief and stress. Those people destroyed my family and never faced any consequences. Someone had to make them pay." "They were doing their jobs," Hamish said quietly. "Following the law, protecting the public. Your parents made mistakes in their business, mistakes that had consequences. That does not justify murder." Crawford laughed bitterly. "You do not understand. You did not watch your father collapse from a heart attack, knowing the stress from those people killed him. You did not visit your mother in a nursing home where she does not even recognize you. They took everything from my family, and the law did nothing, so I became the law." As Crawford was led away to a waiting police van, Hamish stood in the cold mountain air, thinking about revenge and justice, and the thin line between them. David Crawford had become the very thing he claimed to hate, someone who destroyed lives to satisfy his own sense of righteousness. Chapter 6. The Unravelling of David Crawford. David Crawford sat in the interview room at Strathbane Police Station, his hands cuffed to the table, his expression a mixture of defiance and exhaustion. Detective Chief Inspector Blair and Hamish Macbeth sat across from him, a recording device between them documenting everything. Hamish studied Crawford carefully, seeing not a monster but a broken man who had let grief metastasize into murderous obsession. "For the record, state your full name," Blair began. "David Robert Crawford. And you understand you are being charged with 2 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, and 1 count of kidnapping?" Crawford nodded. "I understand. I do not deny any of it." "Then talk us through it," Hamish said. "How did you plan all this?" Crawford leaned back in his chair as much as the cuffs allowed. "I started planning 3 years ago, after my father died. He had a heart attack, massive and fatal. The doctors said it was stress-related, years of accumulated pressure and anxiety from the business failure. My mother was already starting to show signs of dementia. Within a year, she was in a nursing home, lost to me forever. That is when I decided they needed to pay." "Who specifically?" Hamish asked. "Everyone who destroyed my parents," Crawford said. "The suppliers who cheated them and then sued them. The health inspector who shut them down on flimsy evidence. The journalist who wrote those hatchet job articles. The solicitor who handled the bankruptcy and took the last of their money and fees. Every single person who played a part in ruining Glenross Specialty Foods." "How did you identify your targets?" "I spent 2 years researching," Crawford explained. "I went through every document from the bankruptcy, every news article, every complaint filed against my parents. I made a list of the 7 people who had done the most damage. Then I tracked their current locations. I was pleased to find that most of them still lived in or near Loughdube. It made the planning easier." "Tell us about the Hampers," Blair said. "How did you create them?" Crawford almost smiled. "That took the most work. I wanted to use the Glenross name to make sure people knew why they were dying. I researched luxury hamper suppliers, learned about sourcing products, packaging, presentation. I spent over £30,000 creating those 50 hampers, using money from my father's life insurance. I set up a fake business, rented warehouse space, and assembled everything over several months. The 43 clean hampers were legitimate products, no tampering, but 7 specific hampers I carefully modified." "How did you get the aconitine?" Hamish asked. "I grew it myself," Crawford said. "Monkshood plants are not illegal to grow, and extracting the poison is not difficult if you know what you are doing. I studied botany in university before I dropped out to help my parents with the failing business. I learned about toxic plants, found them fascinating. Never thought I would actually use that knowledge, but there we are." Walk us through the logistics, Blair demanded. How did you ensure the right people got the poisoned hampers? Crawford explained his methodology. First, I needed to know who bought which raffle tickets. I volunteered at several village events in the month before Christmas, becoming a familiar enough face that nobody questioned my presence. When Mrs. Wellington left her study to answer the door one evening, I took a photograph of her raffle ticket ledger. That told me who had purchased which numbers. Then I numbered the hampers accordingly, placing poisoned ones in positions that matched tickets purchased by my targets. But the raffle was random, Hamish pointed out. How could you be sure the right numbers would be drawn? I could not be sure, Crawford admitted. That was the one variable I could not control. If the wrong numbers had been drawn, if my targets had not won, I had a backup plan. I would have delivered poisoned gift baskets directly to their homes, claiming they were consolation prizes from the charity. But as it happened, 6 of my 7 targets won hampers in the raffle. Statistically unlikely, but it happened. And Fiona MacLeod, who did not win. She was always going to be different, Crawford said. She was the main architect of my family's destruction, the one who signed the final closure order. I wanted something special for her. I planned to take her, keep her alive long enough to understand why she was dying, then make her consume a poisoned meal. Poetic justice, forcing the health inspector to die from contaminated food. You murdered 2 people, Hamish said quietly. Donald Mackenzie and Jessie Campbell. They were human beings with families who loved them. Does that mean nothing to you? Crawford's expression darkened. Mackenzie cheated my parents out of money and then sued them when they could not pay. His substandard lamb made customers sick, contributing to the health investigation. Campbell reported my parents to the authorities, starting the chain of events that ended in closure. They were not innocent. Neither were you, Hamish shot back. Your parents made real mistakes. They insulted their suppliers in published newsletters. They did not maintain proper food safety standards. The people who acted against them were following the law and protecting the public. Your revenge was built on a distorted version of events where your parents were blameless victims. That is not true, Crawford said, but his voice lacked conviction. Blair leaned forward. You have destroyed your own life, Crawford. You will spend the rest of your days in prison. Was it worth it? For a long moment, Crawford did not answer. Then he said quietly, I do not know anymore. When I was planning this, it seemed so clear. Justice needed to be served, and I was the one to serve it. But now, sitting here, seeing what I have actually done, I do not know. The interview continued for hours, with Crawford providing detailed accounts of every step of his plan. He had been methodical, patient, and disturbingly creative. He had studied poisoning techniques, practiced resealing product containers so tampering was not visible, and carefully calculated dosages to ensure death would be swift once symptoms began. He described watching the village hall from a distance during the raffle, seeing the joy on people's faces as they won their hampers, knowing that some of those people would be dead within days. He talked about the satisfaction he felt when he heard about Donald Mackenzie's death, followed by confusion when he felt no real closure, only emptiness. I thought it would feel like justice, Crawford said. I thought I would feel vindicated, that my parents would somehow be avenged. But all I felt was hollow. Then I told myself I just needed to finish the list. That completion would bring peace. So I continued. The kidnapping of Fiona MacLeod had been the most difficult part, requiring him to track her movements and subdue her in a hotel parking garage using a chloroform-soaked cloth. He had driven her to the remote cottage, kept her sedated, and prepared the final poisoned meal. If the police had not found them when they did, Fiona would have been dead within hours. After the interview concluded, Blair ordered Crawford taken to the cells. Hamish remained in the interview room, reviewing his notes and thinking about the sad trajectory of David Crawford's life. A young man who had dropped out of university to help his struggling parents, who had watched their dreams crumble, who had let grief twist into something dark and murderous. Dr. Ferguson arrived late that afternoon with the final forensic report. We have tested all 12 contaminated items, she told Hamish and Blair. The aconitine levels were precisely calculated. Crawford knew exactly what he was doing. Each contaminated item contained enough poison to kill an adult within an hour of consumption. If all 7 hampers had been consumed as intended, we would have had 7 deaths, not just 2. The victims who survived were lucky, Hamish said. Lucky that we discovered the pattern quickly enough to warn them. Ferguson nodded. Mackenzie and Campbell died because they consumed their contaminated items immediately, before anyone knew there was danger. If they had waited even one more day, they would still be alive. The thought haunted Hamish. 2 lives lost because they had been eager to enjoy their unexpected windfall, because they had opened their prizes too soon. Timing had been everything in this case, a matter of hours determining life or death. Fiona MacLeod was released from hospital that evening, shaken but physically unharmed. Hamish visited her to take a statement. "I do not even remember being taken," she said. "One moment I was walking to my car after the conference. The next I was waking, up in that cottage, unable to move, watching a man prepare food that I somehow knew was meant to kill me. It was like a nightmare." "You were the target Crawford wanted most," Hamish explained. "He blamed you more than anyone for his family's downfall." Fiona shook her head. "I was doing my job. Glenross Specialty Foods had serious safety violations. Products were contaminated, customers were getting sick. I had no choice but to recommend closure. I know the Crawfords felt persecuted, but public safety had to come first." "Did they have any legitimate grievances?" Hamish asked, "about being treated unfairly?" Fiona considered the question carefully. "In hindsight, I think the investigation was aggressive, perhaps more aggressive than it needed to be. There was local sentiment against the Crawfords because they were outsiders, and that may have influenced how vigorously we pursued violations. But the violations were real. The contaminated preserves that made people sick, those were real. The unsafe food handling practices, those were real. We did not fabricate evidence, but we may have been less forgiving than we would have been with a local business owner." "So the Crawfords were both guilty and victims," Hamish said. "Guilty of poor business practices, victims of harsher treatment than locals might have received. And their son took that complex situation and simplified it into a narrative of pure victimhood, justifying murder." Fiona nodded. "He convinced himself his parents were blameless and everyone else was evil. That kind of thinking is dangerous. It allows you to do terrible things while believing you are righteous." That evening, Hamish returned to his police station to find Mrs. Wellington waiting for him. She looked devastated, aged by the events of the past week. "Hamish," she said, "I feel responsible. If I had been more careful with the raffle records, if I had not left them where Crawford could photograph them, none of this would have happened." "You are not responsible," Hamish said firmly. "David Crawford planned this for years. If not this method, he would have found another. You were trying to help people to bring joy to the village at Christmas. That is not something to feel guilty about." "But people died," Mrs. Wellington said, tears in her eyes. 2 people died because of hampers from my charity drive. How do I live with that?" "You live with it by remembering that you had only good intentions," Hamish said gently, "and by honouring the memories of Donald Mackenzie and Jessie Campbell through continuing to do good. Do not let Crawford's evil destroy your capacity for kindness." After she left, Hamish sat alone with lugs at his feet, thinking about the complicated morality of the case. David Crawford had suffered real loss and had witnessed genuine injustice, even if his parents had contributed to their own downfall. But he had responded to that suffering by inflicting even greater suffering on others, creating new victims and new grief. There was no redemption in that, no justice, only a cycle of pain spinning onward. Chapter 7. The Trial of Public Opinion. The arrest of David Crawford made national headlines. "Christmas hamper killer caught," screamed the tabloids. "Son's revenge plot exposed," declared the broadsheets. Television news programs ran segments about the case, discussing food safety, mental health, and the corrosive nature of long-held grudges. Lochdoub found itself under unwelcome scrutiny, with journalists descending on the village to interview residents and photograph the sites connected to the murders. Hamish found himself dealing with media management on top of his usual duties. He gave one carefully worded statement to the press, and then refused all further interviews, directing inquiries to the official police media liaison in Strathbane. But he could not stop the villagers from talking, and many of them did. Mrs. Wellington, despite her distress, spoke to several journalists about the charity raffle and how it had been weaponised. Angela Brodie gave interviews about knowing the Crawfords and reflecting on what went wrong with their business. Even the Curry sisters, Lochdoub's resident moral arbiters, shared their opinions about divine retribution and the wages of sin. The court of public opinion was divided. Some people saw David Crawford as a villain, pure and simple, a murderer who had killed innocent people over a business failure. Others saw him as a tragic figure, a son driven mad by watching his parents destroyed by a heartless system. There were debates on social media about whether the suppliers and officials who had acted against Glenross Specialty Foods bore any moral responsibility for creating the conditions that led to Crawford's breakdown. Hamish watched these debates with growing frustration. People with no connection to the case, who had not seen Donald Mackenzie and Jesse Campbell lying dead, who had not witnessed the fear of the survivors, were treating it like an intellectual exercise or entertainment. The reality of murder was being lost in the noise. Detective Chief Inspector Blair handled the media circus with surprising competence, giving regular press conferences that provided just enough information to satisfy public curiosity without compromising the investigation. He made it clear that David Crawford was a calculating killer, not a sympathetic victim, and that the police had prevented additional deaths through quick action. The 5 surviving targets, Thomas Henderson, Mary Sutherland, Gordon Leslie, Sarah Mitchell, and William Ross, were released from protective custody. Each of them gave statements to the press, expressing relief at being alive and sympathy for the Crawford family's suffering, while firmly stating that Crawford's actions were indefensible. But Hamish noticed something troubling in the village atmosphere. People were dividing into camps. Some residents, particularly those who had never liked the Crawfords, argued that Robert and Margaret Crawford had brought their troubles on themselves through arrogance and poor business practices. Others, particularly those who remembered the Crawfords fondly, argued that the village had treated them unfairly because they were outsiders, and that collective guilt had contributed to David's breakdown. The divisions were creating tensions that threatened the normally peaceful community. Hamish observed arguments in the village shop, cold shoulders at the church, and long-time friends avoiding each other. The murders had opened old wounds and created new ones. He decided to address the situation directly. With the support of Reverend Macpherson, Hamish organised a community meeting at the church hall. Nearly the entire village attended, packing into the space with expressions ranging from curious to hostile. Hamish stood at the front with the minister beside him. "I know these past weeks have been difficult," Hamish began. "We have had deaths in our community, arrests, and intense public scrutiny. It is natural that people have strong feelings about what happened. But I am asking you tonight to remember something important. David Crawford made his own choices. He chose murder. Neither his parents' business failure nor any actions by people in this village forced him to poison anyone. He was responsible for his decisions. But," a voice called from the crowd, "it was Thomas Henderson, the dairy farmer, who had sued the Crawfords." "But what?" Hamish challenged. "But his parents were treated badly?" "Perhaps they were. But does that justify murder? Does anyone in this room believe that Donald Mackenzie deserved to die because of a supplier dispute 15 years ago? Does Jesse Campbell's reporting of customer complaints warrant a death sentence?" The room was silent. Hamish continued. "We all make mistakes. The Crawfords made mistakes in how they ran their business. Some of you," Hamish looked at Henderson, "and the others who had acted against the Crawfords, may have been harsher in your judgments than necessary. But mistakes are not crimes, and responding to mistakes with murder is evil. That is what we need to remember." Reverend Macpherson stepped forward. "Hamish is right. We cannot let this tragedy divide us. Yes, the past should be examined, and we should learn from what happened. But we must also forgive ourselves and each other, and move forward together. David Crawford will face earthly justice in the courts. Our job is to heal our community." Over the following hour, people spoke, sharing their memories of the Crawfords and their feelings about the case. Some confessed to having treated Robert and Margaret poorly. Others defended their actions as necessary business responses. Mary Sutherland, who had testified against the Crawfords in the food safety investigation, spoke tearfully about her guilt and her relief at being alive. By the end of the meeting, the tension had eased slightly. People were talking to each other again, if cautiously. It would take time for complete healing, but at least the process had begun. The legal proceedings against David Crawford moved forward swiftly. He was formally charged with 2 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, kidnapping, and various other offences. His solicitor attempted to argue diminished responsibility due to the trauma of watching his parents' downfall, but the prosecution had little difficulty demonstrating that Crawford had been completely competent and calculating in his actions. The trial was scheduled for the spring, but everyone expected Crawford to plead guilty. In the meantime, Hamish dealt with the aftermath in Loughdoob. The families of Donald Mackenzie and Jessie Campbell were struggling with their losses. Ellen Mackenzie, Donald's widow, had become a recluse, barely leaving her house. The Campbell family had organised a memorial service for Jessie, which the entire village attended. Hamish made a point of visiting Ellen Mackenzie regularly. She would sit in silence mostly, sometimes talking about Donald, sometimes crying. Hamish would make her tea, ensure she had food in the house, and sit with her in companionable silence when she did not want to talk. At one visit, Ellen suddenly asked, "Did my Donald suffer?" "Dr. Brodie says death from aconitine poisoning is extremely painful," Hamish said gently, not wanting to lie to her. But it was relatively quick. Within an hour of eating the honey, he was gone. Ellen nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I keep thinking about that morning. If I had just tasted the honey first, if I had been the one to eat it." "You would be dead instead," Hamish said firmly. "And Donald would be sitting here grieving. The poison was meant for him specifically. Crawford targeted him deliberately." "That does not make it better," Ellen said. "It makes it worse, knowing someone hated my Donald enough to plan his death for years. He was a good man, Hamish. He could be stubborn, and he was not always fair, but he was good." "I know," Hamish said quietly. The trial would provide some closure, he hoped. The victims' families would have a chance to give impact statements, to tell the court what they had lost. Crawford would be sentenced and sent to prison. Justice, as the system defined it, would be served. But Hamish knew that legal justice was only part of what the families needed. They needed time, support, and the space to grieve and heal. As December wore on toward Christmas, the village slowly returned to something approaching normalcy. The Christmas charity drive continued, though Mrs. Wellington had decided to skip the hamper raffle this year, distributing donations through gift vouchers instead. The decorations remained up, and the church prepared for Christmas services, but there was a sombre undertone to the festivities. Hamish attended the Christmas Eve service, standing at the back of the church as Reverend Macpherson spoke about light overcoming darkness, hope persisting through tragedy, and communities healing through compassion. Afterward, people mingled in the church hall, drinking mulled wine and eating mince pies, trying to reclaim the joy that David Crawford had nearly stolen from them. Mrs. Wellington approached Hamish with a cup of wine. "Thank you for organising that community meeting. It helped, truly. The village is starting to feel like itself again." "We will get through this," Hamish said. "Loughdoob is resilient." "But we will not forget," Mrs. Wellington said firmly. "We will remember Donald and Jessie, and we will remember the lesson about how we treat people. Perhaps that is David Crawford's unintentional legacy, a reminder that cruelty, even in small doses, can accumulate into something terrible." Hamish nodded, thinking about how true that was. The Crawfords had not been destroyed by any single action, but by an accumulation of small unkindnesses, business disputes that became personal, and judgments that were harsher than necessary. And their son, in turn, had amplified that cruelty into murder. Chapter 8. The Weight of Consequence. January brought cold winds and harsh reality to Loughdoob. The media circus had moved on to other stories, but the village continued to grapple with the aftermath of the Christmas hamper murders. Hamish noticed the lingering effects everywhere he looked. The shop where Donald Mackenzie had regularly bought his newspaper now had an empty spot where he used to stand. The post office, where Jessie Campbell had worked for decades, felt different without her cheerful presence in retirement. The scars were invisible but deep. David Crawford's trial date was set for March, and the prosecutio was preparing its case. Hamish was called to Strathbane multiple times to review evidence and provide testimony about the investigation. The Crown's case was straightforward and overwhelming. Crawford had confessed in detail, physical evidence tied him to the crimes, and witnesses placed him at key locations. His defence solicitor had shifted strategy, from attempting to prove innocence to arguing for leniency based on extenuating circumstances. But Hamish doubted any jury would be sympathetic after hearing about the calculated nature of the poisonings. In late January, Hamish received an unexpected visitor at the police station. Margaret Crawford's nurse from the Inverness care home called to say that Mrs. Crawford had died peacefully in her sleep. The nurse thought Hamish should know since he had been investigating crimes connected to the family. Hamish drove to Inverness to make arrangements for Margaret's burial. David Crawford, sitting in prison awaiting trial, was informed of his mother's death. He requested permission to attend the funeral, which was granted under strict security conditions. The funeral was held on a grey February morning at a small cemetery outside Inverness. Only a handful of people attended. Hamish was there in his official capacity, along with several guards, watching David Crawford, who sat in handcuffs throughout the brief service. A few distant relatives who barely knew Margaret came out of obligation. No one from Lochdoub attended. As the minister spoke the traditional words of committal, Hamish watched David Crawford's face. The younger man wept silently, his shoulders shaking. Whatever rage had driven him to murder seemed to have burned itself out, leaving only grief and regret. After the service, Crawford was allowed a few moments at his mother's grave before being taken back to prison. He knelt in the frozen grass, handcuffs clinking, and whispered words that Hamish could not hear. Then the guards lifted him up and led him away. That evening, Hamish received a call from Crawford's solicitor. "Mr. Crawford has asked if you would visit him. He says he wants to talk to you off the record about his parents and what happened." "Why me?" Hamish asked. "You are the one who arrested him. I think he respects that you treated him fairly, that you listened to him even while pursuing justice. He does not want to talk to the prosecutors or the psychiatrists. He wants to talk to you." Hamish agreed, curious about what Crawford wanted to say. He visited the prison the next day, sitting across from Crawford in a private interview room. Crawford looked thinner, paler, diminished. "Thank you for coming," Crawford said quietly. "And thank you for attending my mother's funeral. You did not have to do that." "I wanted to pay respects to your mother," Hamish said. "Whatever happened with the business, she did not deserve what happened to her at the end." Crawford nodded. She was a good woman, kind, creative, passionate about food and tradition. My father was the business mind, but she was the heart of Glenross Specialty Foods. When it failed, when people turned against them, it destroyed her. She never recovered. I visited her every month in the nursing home, even though she did not recognize me for the last year. I would sit with her, hold her hand, tell her about my life. And I would promise her that I would make things right, that I would make the people who hurt her pay for what they did. "And now?" Hamish asked. "Now she is dead, and so are two people who did not deserve to die," Crawford said, his voice breaking. "I told myself I was avenging my parents, honouring their memory. But I was just feeding my own anger. And the terrible thing is, I knew it even while I was doing it. When I was growing the monk's hood, extracting the poison, planning the hampers, part of me was screaming that this was wrong, but I could not stop. The need for revenge had become more important than anything else." "Why are you telling me this?" Hamish asked. "Because you will testify at my trial, and I want you to understand something," Crawford said. "I am guilty. I murdered Donald Mackenzie and Jesse Campbell. I tried to murder 5 others. I kidnapped Fiona MacLeod. I deserve every year of prison I will receive. But I want you to tell people that my parents did not create me. They were good people who made mistakes. What I did was my choice, not the result of their failures or anyone else's actions. I do not want my crimes to further tarnish their memory." Hamish listened, trying to understand the complicated man before him. "You could tell people that yourself at trial, in your statement." "I will," Crawford agreed, "but I wanted you to hear it first. You were fair to me, Constable Macbeth. You investigated thoroughly. You caught me. You stopped me from killing more people. But you never treated me like I was just evil. You tried to understand. That is rare. After leaving the prison, Hamish drove back to Loch Dubh through falling snow, thinking about David Crawford's words. Understanding evil did not excuse it, but it might help prevent future tragedies. If communities were more careful about how they treated people, especially outsiders, and those who were struggling, perhaps fewer David Crawfords would be created. Back in Loch Dubh, preparations were underway for a memorial to be installed in the village square. Ellen Mackenzie and the Campbell family had worked together to design a simple stone bench with a plaque reading, "In memory of Donald Mackenzie and Jessie Campbell, beloved members of our community. May we always remember them with love and honour their lives by treating others with kindness." The memorial was unveiled in late February on a surprisingly mild day. Most of the village attended, standing in sombre silence as Reverend Macpherson blessed the bench and spoke about the importance of community and compassion. Ellen Mackenzie and Jessie's daughter each laid flowers on the bench, tears streaming down their faces. Hamish stood with Dr. Brodie and Angela, watching the ceremony. The village was healing, slowly but surely. But healing required acknowledging what had been lost and committing to doing better. Detective Chief Inspector Blair attended the memorial, representing the police force. Afterward, he pulled Hamish aside. "The trial starts next week, Macbeth. Crawford is pleading guilty to all charges. The sentencing hearing will focus on mitigation and victim impact statements. You will need to testify about the investigation." "I will be there," Hamish confirmed. Blair looked at the memorial bench, his expression uncharacteristically thoughtful. This was a strange case. Usually murder is simple. Someone gets angry, someone gets greedy, someone gets jealous, and they kill. This was different. Crawford spent years planning his revenge, convincing himself he was righteous. That kind of delusion is dangerous. "It is," Hamish agreed, "and it is difficult to prevent. How do you stop someone who believes they are serving justice?" "You cannot," Blair said. "All you can do is catch them after they act and make sure they cannot harm anyone else. We did that, at least." The trial of David Crawford took place in Edinburgh in early March. Hamish attended along with other key witnesses. The courtroom was packed with media, victims' families, and curious members of the public. Crawford pleaded guilty to all charges, sparing the court a lengthy trial. The sentencing hearing focused on the impact statements from victims' families and the arguments about appropriate punishment. Ellen Mackenzie spoke about losing her husband of 40 years, about the pain of knowing he died in agony, about the emptiness of her life now. Jessie Campbell's daughter spoke about her mother's kindness and community service, about the cruelty of her being murdered for simply doing her job. The 5 survivors each spoke about the fear they had experienced, the nightmares they still had, and the knowledge that they had come within hours or minutes of death. Fiona MacLeod described waking up drugged and helpless, watching Crawford prepare her final poisoned meal, certain she would die. The defence solicitor argued that Crawford had suffered severe trauma from watching his parents destroyed, that he had acted from grief rather than malice, and that he deserved some leniency. But the judge was unmoved. "David Crawford, you have pleaded guilty to crimes of extraordinary calculation and cruelty," the judge said in his sentencing remarks. "You spent years planning these murders, carefully creating deadly weapons disguised as gifts, and targeting people who were simply doing their jobs or protecting their legitimate business interests. 2 people died agonizing deaths because of your actions. 5 others came perilously close to the same fate, and 1 woman endured the terror of kidnapping and attempted murder. You have expressed remorse, but your remorse came only after you were caught, only after you could do no more harm. That is not true repentance, but merely regret at being stopped. I sentence you to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 30 years for each murder, to be served concurrently, along with additional sentences for the attempted murders and kidnapping. You will be eligible for parole in 30 years, when you are 65 years old. Whether you are ever released will depend on whether you can demonstrate genuine rehabilitation and remorse. Take him down." David Crawford was led from the courtroom without looking back. His solicitor indicated there would be no appeal. The case was closed. Hamish left the courthouse and walked through Edinburgh's cold streets, feeling the weight of the past months lifting slightly. Justice had been served, at least as well as the system could serve it. The guilty had been punished, the community was healing, and life in Loch Dubh would continue. But he knew that the scars from this case would never fully fade. Chapter 9. The Return to Peace. Spring came late to the Highlands that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a sense of renewal to Loch Dubh. The snow melted from the hills, revealing green grass and early wildflowers. The loch, frozen for months, thawed and sparkled in the lengthening days. And the village, which had endured so much darkness over the winter, began to remember what light felt like. Hamish resumed his normal routines, patrolling the quiet roads, checking on elderly residents, and dealing with the minor complaints and disputes that constituted normal village policing. After months of murder investigation, the return to mundane problems was oddly comforting. Mrs. Wellington organised an Easter charity drive, carefully avoiding any hampers or raffles, instead hosting a simple bake sale that raised money for the church roof repair fund. The community responded enthusiastically, baking dozens of cakes and biscuits, as if trying to reclaim the spirit of generosity that David Crawford had nearly destroyed. Ellen Mackenzie attended the bake sale, her first public appearance since her husband's funeral. She brought a batch of Donald's favourite shortbread, made from his mother's recipe. People gathered around her, offering condolences and support. Hamish watched from across the church hall as Ellen slowly smiled for the first time in months. She was beginning to heal. The memorial bench in the village square became a gathering place. People would sit there to eat lunch, to chat with neighbours, or simply to pause and remember. The Curry sisters took to leaving fresh flowers on the bench weekly, their way of honouring the dead, and perhaps atoning for any past unkindnesses. Thomas Henderson, the dairy farmer who had sued the Crawfords 15 years earlier, made a donation to a mental health charity in David Crawford's name. It was an odd gesture, both an acknowledgement of his role in the Crawford family's suffering and a recognition that David Crawford had been a damaged person who needed help he never received. Hamish heard that several other people connected to the Glen Ross Specialty Foods case, Sarah Mitchell the journalist, Gordon Leslie the solicitor, and William Ross the health inspector, had each made similar gestures of reconciliation. They could not change the past, but they could try to honour its lessons. Angela Brodie, who had been deeply affected by the case, wrote an article for a Highland history journal about Glen Ross Specialty Foods. She researched the business thoroughly, interviewing people who remembered it and examining records from its brief existence. Her article was balanced, acknowledging both the Crawfords' enthusiasm and mistakes, and the community's complex response to them. "Some people are praising your article," Hamish told Angela when they met for coffee in April. "Others are criticising it for being too sympathetic to the Crawfords." Angela smiled wryly. "You cannot please everyone. But I felt it was important to document the full story, not just the sensational murder case that came at the end. Robert and Margaret Crawford were real people with real dreams. They failed, and they were treated harshly by some people, fairly by others. Their son's response to that failure was monstrous, but that does not erase the human tragedy that preceded it." "History is complicated, Hamish." "Exactly," Hamish agreed, "and ignoring that complexity only creates the conditions for future tragedies." In late April, Hamish received a letter from David Crawford. It was not unexpected. The prison had notified him that Crawford had requested his address. Hamish debated whether to read it, then decided he owed Crawford that much. "Constable Macbeth," the letter read, "I am writing to you from prison where I will spend the rest of my productive life. I have had months now to think about what I did, and I want you to know that I understand the magnitude of my crimes. I took 2 lives and nearly took 5 more. I terrorized a community and destroyed any chance I had for a normal life. I was driven by anger and grief, but those are explanations, not excuses. I chose murder. I chose to spend years planning death instead of choosing to heal. I should have sought therapy, should have talked to someone about my pain. Instead, I let it consume me until I became the very thing I claimed to hate, someone who destroyed innocent lives. I am writing to ask if you would be willing to visit me occasionally, not as a police officer investigating crimes, but as someone who might be willing to listen to a man trying to understand how he became a monster. I have no right to ask this of you, and I will understand if you refuse. But you were fair to me when fairness was not required, and I respect that. Whether you visit or not, I want you to know that I am grateful you stopped me when you did. If you had not found me, Fiona MacLeod would be dead, and I would have continued down my list until everyone was gone. You saved lives, Constable Macbeth, even while taking away my freedom. Thank you for that. David Crawford. Hamish folded the letter and set it aside. He was not sure how to respond. Part of him wanted nothing more to do with David Crawford, to let the man rot in his cell and face his guilt alone. But another part of him, the part that had become a police officer to help people rather than simply punish them, wondered if Crawford could still be redeemed in some way. He discussed it with Dr. Brodie one evening over a dram of whisky. Should I visit him? What purpose would it serve? Hamish asked the older physician. Dr. Brodie considered the question carefully. It depends on what you hope to achieve. If you want to help Crawford understand his crimes and become a better person, even in prison, then visiting might serve a purpose. If you simply want to punish him, then do not go. Let him face his guilt alone. Is redemption possible for someone who planned murder for years? Hamish wondered aloud. I am not a religious man, Brodie said, though I have lived with the Reverend Macpherson's influence for years. But I believe people can change, even terrible people. Whether Crawford will change is up to him. You cannot redeem him, Hamish. He has to redeem himself. You can only bear witness to the attempt. Hamish thought about that conversation for days. Finally, he wrote back to Crawford, Mr. Crawford, I will visit you once. If after that visit I believe you are genuinely trying to understand your crimes and take responsibility for them, I may visit again. But I will not be your confessor or your therapist. If you want redemption, you will have to work for it through proper channels, counselling, education, service to others even in prison. I can only be someone who reminds you of what you did and why it was wrong. If that is useful to you, then we can talk. Constable Hamish Macbeth. He never heard back from Crawford, but he suspected the letter had been received. Perhaps Crawford was thinking about what genuine redemption might require. Loch Dubh continued its slow return to normalcy through the spring. The tourist season began in May, bringing visitors who knew nothing of the Christmas murders and simply enjoyed the Highland beauty. The village shops did brisk business, and the hotel filled with guests enjoying walking and fishing. Hamish found himself dealing with lost tourists, minor traffic issues, and the occasional drunk causing problems at the hotel bar, the normal problems of village policing. He was grateful for the mundane routine. Mrs. Wellington organised a memorial service on the 6-month anniversary of the murders. It was a quiet affair, not heavily publicised, intended mainly for those directly affected. Hamish attended, standing in the back of the church as Reverend Macpherson spoke about loss, healing, and the resilience of community. Ellen Mackenzie read a poem she had written about Donald. Jessie Campbell's daughter sang a hymn her mother had loved. People cried, but they also smiled, remembering good times and celebrating lives well lived despite their tragic ends. After the service, Hamish walked to the memorial bench and sat for a while. Lugs lay at his feet, and Sonsi, who had followed them from the station, curled up beside him. The sun was setting, painting the loch in shades of gold and crimson. It was beautiful, peaceful, a reminder of why he had chosen to make his home in Loch Dubh. Dr. Brodie joined him on the bench. Penny for your thoughts, Constable. Hamish smiled slightly. Just thinking about how fragile peace is, how quickly it can be shattered by one person's anger, but also how resilient communities can be when they choose to heal together. Brodie nodded. Loch Dubh has been through something terrible, but we will survive. We will remember Donald and Jessie, we will learn from what happened, and we will continue. That is what communities do. They endure. They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell and stars began to appear over the loch. Somewhere far away, David Crawford sat in his cell, living with the consequences of his choices. The families of his victims were rebuilding their lives around the holes he had torn in them, and Loch Dubh, battered but unbroken, was finding its way back to peace. Hamish knew there would be other cases, other crimes, other troubles. That was the nature of police work, the nature of human existence. People made mistakes, hurt each other, sometimes destroyed each other, but they also forgave, healed, and rebuilt. The balance between darkness and light was constant, eternal. His job was to stand in that balance, protecting the light wherever he could. And in that moment, sitting on a memorial bench in a Highland village as stars emerged overhead, Hamish Macbeth felt he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Chapter 10. The Gift of Remembrance. December returned to Lochdoub, bringing with it the first anniversary of the Christmas Hamper murders. The village approached the holiday season with a mixture of celebration and solemn remembrance, determined to honour their dead, while reclaiming the joy that David Crawford had tried to steal. Hamish spent the early part of the month helping Mrs. Wellington organise a charity drive that was deliberately different from previous years. Instead of hampers or raffles, they collected cash donations and purchased gift vouchers that recipients could use at local shops. It was practical, safe, and carried none of the psychological weight of wrapped packages that might contain hidden horrors. The community responded generously. Even families that were struggling themselves contributed what they could. It was as if people needed to prove that generosity could still exist, that Christmas could still be about giving without fear. Ellen Mackenzie had moved forward with her life in remarkable ways. She had sold the farm, unable to continue working it alone, and bought a small cottage in the village. She volunteered at the church, helped with the charity drive, and had become a visible, active member of the community again. Hamish often saw her at the memorial bench, sitting quietly with her memories, but she was no longer defined solely by her loss. On Christmas Eve morning, exactly 1 year after the murders, a special memorial service was held. The church was full, with people standing in the aisles and doorway. Reverend Macpherson spoke about the previous year's tragedy and the year of healing that had followed. "We cannot pretend the darkness never happened," the minister said. "Donald Mackenzie and Jessie Campbell were taken from us by deliberate evil. Their deaths scarred our community. But look at what we have done with that pain. We have come together. We have supported each other. We have learned to be more careful in how we treat people, more aware that our actions have consequences we cannot always foresee." Ellen Mackenzie stood and spoke about her husband. "Donald was not perfect," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "He could be stubborn and hot-tempered. He made mistakes in business and in life. But he was good, and he was loved, and he deserved to live out his natural span. David Crawford took that from him, from me, from our children and grandchildren. I have had to learn to forgive, not for Crawford's sake, but for mine. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting. It means choosing not to let hate consume me the way it consumed the man who killed my husband." Jessie Campbell's daughter spoke similarly about her mother. Mum was a kind woman who believed in doing the right thing, even when it was difficult. She reported those customer complaints because people were getting sick, and she felt she had a moral duty to protect them. For that, she was murdered. How do you make sense of something so senseless? You cannot. You can only decide how you will respond to it. And I have decided to honour Mum by living the way she lived, with kindness and integrity. After the service, people gathered in the church hall for tea and Christmas biscuits. The atmosphere was subdued but warm. Hamish moved through the crowd, accepting thanks from people who appreciated his role in solving the case and protecting the community. Detective Chief Inspector Blair had sent a message from Strathbane, expressing his respects and noting that the case had been officially closed. David Crawford would serve his 30 years minimum, and all appeals had been exhausted. That afternoon, Hamish drove to the prison in Inverness. He had decided to make his visit to David Crawford on this significant anniversary. The prison was grim under grey winter skies, all concrete and razor wire, a place designed to punish and contain. Crawford was brought to the visiting room in handcuffs, which were removed once he was seated across from Hamish. He looked older than his 35 years, worn down by a year of incarceration and guilt. "Thank you for coming, Constable," Crawford said quietly. "I did not think you would, especially not today." "Why today?" Hamish asked. "Because today is the anniversary of what I did. I thought you would want to be with the families, not visiting the man who destroyed them. I am here because I said I would visit if I thought you were genuinely trying to take responsibility for your crimes," Hamish explained. "Are you?" Crawford nodded slowly. "I am working with a prison psychologist, attending therapy sessions, trying to understand how I became capable of murder. It is difficult. Every time I think I understand, I realize there is another layer of self-deception to unpack. I told myself I was avenging my parents, but really I was feeding my own ego. I wanted to feel powerful after years of feeling helpless." "What have you learned?" Hamish asked. "That revenge is not justice," Crawford said. "Justice seeks to restore balance and prevent future harm. Revenge only seeks to inflict pain equal to what you have suffered. And even if you succeed in inflicting that pain, you are not healed. You are just another person who has caused suffering. I killed 2 people and traumatized countless others, and my parents are still dead. Nothing was fixed. Nothing was made better. I just created more grief." Hamish listened, trying to determine if Crawford was genuinely remorseful or simply saying what he thought people wanted to hear. It was difficult to tell. Psychopaths could mimic remorse convincingly, but so could genuinely repentant people who struggled to articulate their feelings. "Have you written to the families?" Hamish asked. Crawford shook his head. "My solicitor advised against it. He said it might seem manipulative or self-serving, but I think about them constantly. I see Ellen Mackenzie's face in my dreams, the way she looked at me during the trial. I hear Jessie Campbell's daughter talking about her mother. I think about the 5 people I tried to kill and how they must jump at shadows now, always afraid someone is trying to hurt them. That will be my real punishment, carrying that weight forever." "You will be eligible for parole in 30 years, Hamish said. "What will you do if you are released?" Crawford looked surprised, as if he had not thought that far ahead. "I do not know. I'm 35 now. I will be 65 then if I live that long, an old man who spent his productive years in prison. What kind of life is waiting for someone like me?" "That depends on who you become in the next 30 years, Hamish said. "You can spend that time dwelling on your anger and self-pity, or you can spend it genuinely trying to become a better person. You can pursue education, help other prisoners, work toward redemption even if it never earns you freedom. The choice is yours." After the visit, Hamish sat in his Land Rover in the prison car park, thinking about redemption and whether it was truly possible for someone like David Crawford. He did not have an answer. He drove back to Loch Dubh as evening fell, arriving just as the village Christmas lights came on. Strings of lights crisscrossed the main street. Shop windows glowed with festive displays, and people hurried through the cold carrying wrapped presents and shopping bags. It looked like any other Highland village at Christmas, peaceful and welcoming. But Hamish knew the scars that lay beneath the surface. He stopped at the memorial bench, brushing snow from its surface and reading the plaque once more. "In memory of Donald Mackenzie and Jessie Campbell, beloved members of our community. May we always remember them with love and honour their lives by treating others with kindness." That last line resonated with Hamish. The lesson of this terrible case was not just about catching killers or punishing crimes. It was about how communities treated their members, especially those who were struggling or different. The Crawfords had been outsiders who faced hostility and harsh judgment. Some of that treatment had been justified by their mistakes, but some had been cruel and unnecessary. David Crawford had taken that cruelty and amplified it into murder, but the original cruelty had existed first. If Loch Dubh wanted to prevent future tragedies, it needed to be more compassionate, more forgiving, more willing to help rather than condemn. Mrs. Wellington found him sitting on the bench. "Hamish," she said, "come to my house for dinner. You should not be alone on Christmas Eve." "I am all right, Mrs. Wellington," Hamish said. "Just thinking." "About the case?" "About life," Hamish corrected gently. "About how we build communities that heal rather than harm. About whether someone like David Crawford could have been saved if people had reached out to him after his parents died." Mrs. Wellington sat beside him on the bench. "I have thought about that too. When Robert died and Margaret went into the nursing home, David was left completely alone. People in the village knew he existed, but no one reached out. We were all too busy with our own lives. Or we still held grudges against his parents. If someone had befriended him, offered support, maybe he would not have spent 3 years planning murder. Or maybe he would have done it anyway, Hamish said. We cannot know, but we can learn the lesson and do better going forward. When people in this village are struggling, we need to help them, not judge them. Mrs. Wellington nodded. That is what the bench reminds us. Kindness. Such a simple thing, but so powerful. They sat together as snow began to fall again, covering the village in white silence. Christmas Eve in Loughdoob, 1 year after murders had shattered the peace, and the village endured. That evening Hamish attended the midnight Christmas service, standing in the back of the crowded church as Reverend Macpherson celebrated the birth of hope into a dark world. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Light overcoming darkness, hope persisting through tragedy, communities healing through faith and compassion. After the service, people wished each other Merry Christmas, with perhaps more feeling than usual. They had been through darkness together and had emerged intact. That created bonds that would last. Hamish walked home through the snowy streets, lugs trotting beside him. His police station was warm and welcoming, the fire burning brightly. Sonsie greeted them with her usual imperious expression, as if annoyed they had been gone so long. Hamish settled into his favourite chair, pouring himself a dram of whisky. It was Christmas morning now, the village asleep, peaceful and safe. He thought about David Crawford sitting in his prison cell, Ellen Mackenzie in her cottage, the 5 survivors living their lives with the knowledge of how close they had come to death. He thought about Loughdoob and its complicated history, its capacity for both cruelty and kindness. And he thought about his role in all of it, a police officer trying to maintain order and protect people in a world where chaos was always threatening. He did not have answers to the big questions. He did not know if David Crawford would ever truly be redeemed, if the families would ever fully heal, if the village would completely move past this tragedy. But he knew that life continued, that people endured, and that his job was to stand in the gap between darkness and light, doing what he could to tip the balance toward light. Outside, snow continued to fall on Loughdoob, covering everything in clean white. A new Christmas, a new beginning, a chance to do better. And in his warm station, Police Constable Hamish Macbeth raised his glass in a silent toast to Donald Mackenzie and Jessie Campbell, to Ellen and the Campbell family, to a community that had endured, and to the hope that kindness in the end would prove stronger than hate. Merry Christmas, Loughdoob. May we all deserve the peace we seek. The end.